Alright, what's up everybody? Today is going to be a little bit of a story time. The broad topic is going to be leaving home. You might have guessed that from the title. But I just basically want to share my story about leaving home. And when I say leaving home, I generally mean the country, so your home country, whether that's for a long term or just for a holiday. But yeah, I just want to share my story about that. I'm sure I will touch on it at some point in the future, maybe go into more detail with it. Just want to give a brief outline of my story at this time and share some of my thoughts and some of the things that I feel are important about it. So, from a pretty young age, I always had quite a strong desire to see the world, to see different places. I was born in Sydney, Australia, which is a beautiful place, but it never it never had a feeling of contentment to it. I always had a sense, and I don't know how many people out there could relate to this, but I always had a sense that I was stuck, or at least I was only on one very specific point on the earth, which is this gigantic thing. And the thought of spending my days from birth until death there, it scared the shit out of me. It just wasn't at all something that I could come to terms with. And I think from that time in my life, I really made a mental note to get out there and see the world. Um, a big one was Europe. I always thought about that. My family, my heritage is from Europe, so I think that called to me a lot. But Southeast Asia, America, South America, there was a lot of points of interest to me, and I would talk about it pretty regularly. Um, so it wasn't until a bit later in my life, I was about 22 when I did my first trip. I just went with a buddy to Thailand, and as you do, it's a pretty known tourist destination. But it still did have a big impact on me. I loved my time there, and I really took away that different viewpoint of the different culture and the different way of living, and it sat with me a lot. So it wasn't until a couple years later that I did another trip, and I ended up in Bali. So the trip was only for 5 days in Bali. Then I was doing a second trip to Thailand and Cambodia, and then I was going home. It turns out on the fourth day of my 5 day holiday, I cancelled my flights home from Thailand to Australia and booked a return flight to Bali. Um, at this point, that was around 3 years ago, and I've been living in Bali ever since, and I can safely say it's one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And it's definitely, without question, the decision in my life that's had the most impact on me. It's led me to the most change, to the most self-awakening, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm very grateful for that. To quickly explain it, I guess I was presented with an opportunity in those 4 days, an opportunity for business, an opportunity for an alternative life and lifestyle, something that I hadn't experienced before, but something that had, as I said, called to me a lot in my younger years. Um, I definitely had a big pull to Europe, and since that point, I have actually been to Europe and I've traveled around, and I always saw myself, at least spending 6 months to a year there. But for as the world works in strange ways, this is where I ended up, and yeah, I guess I just want to touch on a few of the things that I think are important about that. Some things that I could foresee when I was younger, and then also some things that I more or less realized while I've been away. First of all, I think independence is one of the big factors of traveling, going overseas, and I think that's a good time to point out that whereas you do get a lot from traveling when you're younger or traveling with family, it's not really the same experience as when you do it by yourself, when you do it with friends. So, I did quite a lot of traveling when I was younger. I was, a pretty lucky kid, and my mum took me on some great holidays. I saw some different parts of the world, but the real experience, although that does give you the perspective change, it definitely does. But the real perspective comes when you're out there by yourself. You're independent, not codependent. So also, I think that goes hand in hand with being a little bit older. When you're younger, you don't have the ability to process things as well, and I think that takes away from the experience a little bit, but not a lot. So for the purpose of this video, I am talking about traveling alone or with friends in your older years. So The second thing, and probably the most important, I definitely feel it's the most important thing for me, is a perspective change. I use a couple of different ways to describe it. One of my favorite ways to describe the perspective change is I call it a perspective window. And the way I see that is that we look through life through a certain window. So from the ages of 0 to 16 or whenever I did my first trip, I'd only been able to see the world through one window, and that was Sydney, Australia. That was my viewpoint. That was the way that I saw the world. That's the way I saw culture and society. And until you leave that, you're not able to, as much as people tell you stories or you research on the internet, you're really not able to consider what it's actually like to be in that place and to have an entire society and an entire culture flipped on its head. So for Western cultures, I guess that change is a little bit more subtle. But then you go to really different cultures like Southeast Asia, or I'm guessing Africa, just different places. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with that. But I just want to really drive home that point of the perspective window. I'll definitely go into more detail on that in some other videos because it's something that I look at a lot. But for me, every place I've been to in the world has given me a different window to look at the world through. And, that's come so far up until this point. I've been to quite a lot of different countries over the world, and each one of those have given me its own little specific viewpoint on the world and a whole different way of thinking that I'm able to now analyze thoughts within myself, thoughts that are within my life and around me, decisions that I have to make. And, that will obviously continue to grow. Each new place that I go to will give me another window to look through. And I think that's invaluable for the basic reason that the more windows you have, the more different perspectives you have to look at life, to look on life through, the better. That definitely just can't take away from your experience at all. People in Indonesia do things completely differently to the way people do it in Australia, in America, in Greece, in Croatia, etc., etc. And the more different places you see, the more chances you have to realize that there's not one way of doing things. There's a million ways of doing things. The way people do things here, people in Australia couldn't even care less about, and vice versa. The way people do things there, the people here really, it not only does it not pop into their heads, but it doesn't even register as even slightly important. And that goes for laws, that goes for rules, that goes for different cultural importances or differences. And that really gives you this intense ability to look at the world in a very, I'd say, a fair way. Instead of being a judgmental type of person, it leads you to be more open-minded and really keep yourself open to possibilities, which is a very good trait to have. So without blabbering on too much, I know the video is quite long already. I just want to wrap on, I think, the difference between people who do get out there and people who don't. And, how it can actually take away from your life. You might feel like things are important where you are. You want to stay there. That's where you want to dedicate your time and your energy. But getting out there, seeing something different in the world, whether you do go away for a long time or a short time, obviously the longer you're away, the more that your paradigm of thinking can change and has potential to grow and learn. But even short holidays, that will do the trick. As long as the culture is different enough, it will give you a sense of perspective that you haven't experienced before. And as I said, I think that's invaluable. People, you see these type of people, you've met them in your life, definitely. They're the kind of the cliche, stereotypical guy or girl, and they've been living in that same place their entire life, and they call that home, and their mums and dads and grandparents before them, they were all just there. And there's something, whereas I'm not saying that's any bad judgment on one's character, but there is something one-dimensional to that type of person, I feel, and at least generally speaking. And it's not their fault. It's just from living in one place your entire life, it limits you. There's a whole gigantic world out there, and it's just begging to be seen and visited. And the more that we progress with the internet and connectivity, that gap or that difference between us all is growing smaller. But there's just some things that you can't get from the internet, and it really just calls to get out there and go and see it. So I think that's all for now. As I said, I'll probably revisit this topic. It's a pretty big one for me at some time in the future. And as always, I'm always happy to hear what people think. So just let me know.